first reading is from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 20 to 23, and it's on page 1211. By faith, Abraham blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. And then going back to Genesis chapter 50, verse 22 to 26, the death of Joseph. It's on page 57. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the 3rd generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." So Joseph died at the age of 110. And after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
It'll be helpful to have your Bibles open at Hebrews 11 as we look at what's going on here this morning. Now, we're going to begin in Auckland Castle in County Durham, which used to be the home of the Prince Bishops of Durham. Now, that was in the days when bishops were treated like members of the aristocracy. But now it's open to the public. And when I went round, I found in the former dining room the most amazing collection of paintings. They're known as the Zubarans, paintings by the Spanish master Francisco de Zubaran, and they were bought by a former Bishop of Durham for his seat in Bishop Auckland in the northwest of England. And when in 2010 the church commissioners, the Church of England is a bit more down on its suppers these days than it was then. When they tried to sell these paintings to raise a bit of money, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, launched an appeal that they might be saved for the nation. And so today you can still see them in the castle, although I think that since I went, a new gallery has been built to house them. And the paintings show Jacob and his 12 sons, the sons of Israel. Now, Jacob's story is a long one, and partway through his name is changed to Israel. But his sons become part of a dynasty that is to form the future tribes of Israel and the whole Jewish nation that moved into the promised land. You can see the line of succession here. It's the slide that we had up earlier, and I've got Ashley's great gizmo that he lent me, Apparently he used to use this to look at the accounts at the annual general meeting on the screen. But I think I might be able to point this. Oh, yes. Is this working? Oh, dear. I thought, is it? I got it in the... Oh, yes, there we are. So there's Abraham, son of Terah, and Isaac, and Jacob, and that's Judah. Now, he's in blue because that's the line that came down to Jesus, who's sometimes called the Lion of Judah. But here are all the sons that Jacob had, including Joseph, who's here, and Benjamin, Jacob's final son. And they're the ones who became the children of Israel in the Promised Land, Joseph and his brothers. Now, it's hard to portray a dynasty, isn't it? These paintings are the only ones I've seen of an artist trying to portray the different personalities of Jacob and his sons. So here, perhaps fittingly, Joseph, with papers in hand, looks rather like the administrator that he was to become when he ruled over Egypt. And we'll come back to that later. Picking successors in a large family dynasty is a story that's never become dated. Here is the family patriarch of a more recent dynasty with descendants and possible successors all around. The Sky television drama Succession follows the Roy family based in New York. Logan Roy owns a global media corporation and he begins to experience failing health. And so his 4 children, all of whom have varying degrees of connection to the company, begin to prepare for a future without their father. And they vie for prominence within the company. This, says the publicity, is a family that is determined to take what's yours. How different then is the generational succession that we find in Hebrews 11? Because here we find a dynasty that is created by God and called by him, not for personal gain, but to bless the generations that succeed them, with the eventual goal of blessing the whole world. And as we heard last week, it started with Abraham, who left Ur of the Chaldees and travelled to Haran. So here he is. And then he spends quite a bit of time around the land of Canaan, where all the people are eventually going to settle. And God gave him this promise: I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all people on earth will be blessed through you. Listen carefully here to what God is promising. I will bless you. You will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. All people on earth will be blessed through you. Building his life on that promise, Abraham was always looking forward, seeking God for this promise to come to fruition. And if we look back in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 12 on page 1209, it says this, Hebrews 11:12, and so from this one man, Abraham, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. As we read Hebrews 11, we're invited to stand back and view how the panoply of history moves from the promise of blessing given to Abraham to its culmination in Christ. The whole flow of the narrative in this letter to the Hebrews is about salvation history, about working towards the climax of history in the redeeming work of Jesus by his cross and resurrection. And it shows a train of blessing that God sets in motion across different generations, cultures, and people groups. And here in Hebrews 11, we find an astonishing list of people in a succession story that is not about power and greed, but a story with a message of blessing and hope, even in the midst of persecution and struggle. Lives lived in faith that bring a train of blessing in which you and I are caught up today. So this morning, we're focusing on just a few generations within this dynasty, those around Joseph. And if you're looking for a riveting read this holiday season, can I suggest the saga of this family in Genesis chapters 12 to 50? I tell you, it matches anything you might find in a modern television soap. Yet as you read, notice how God redeems all that the people get up to in order to bring blessing. We're going to look at the blessings that cross the different generations under 3 sections. And they're these: Abraham and the promise of blessing, Jacob and the provision of blessing, Joseph and the providence of blessing, which kind of sounds a bit cheesy, but I just woke up one day and God gave it to me, so I thought, right, I'll go with this. First of all, Abraham and the promise of blessing. Now, the original promise given to Abraham in Genesis 12 is passed on to his son Isaac, who inherits. So Genesis 26:3 tells us that God said to Isaac, "I will be with you and will bless you. I will confirm the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed." Isaac then passed on the blessing to the next generation, to his own sons, Jacob and Esau. So the writer to the Hebrews sums up Isaac's life like this, chapter 11, verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. Now, this still happens today in God's kingdom. Church is where emerging generations receive the blessings of those who've gone before. It's been said quite rightly that it takes a whole church to raise a child. So don't ever think that as you age, you have no contribution to make to children, to young people, or anyone in the generations below you. God has designed blessing to flow from generations to other generations so that all of us can flourish together. When I was in the sixth form, I was part of a church youth group that met every Sunday after the evening service. There was a meeting every week, but all of the gatherings, I mean, it must be loads, I can only remember 2. The first one was when the curate who ran the group explained to us the evening service that we just attended. Now, this was 1970. So the service that we'd just been to was called Evensong from the Book of Common Prayer. It had been published in 1662 and was in rather old-fashioned English as far as I was concerned, that sounded a bit more modern than the Shakespeare I was doing at school, but not a lot more. But when this man explained how it all fitted together, for me as a theoretical learner, it was absolutely transformational. All of a sudden, evening worship made sense for me. And it was interesting because the structure that he gave, we still use it. If you come to the 6, it doesn't look like there's a structure, but there is. Actually, it looks like Evensong, really. Anyway, never mind, that's another talk. The only other meeting, though, that I remember, which is here really is the relevant one, I remember that 3 older people in the church came to share their testimonies with us, what we now call their stories. Although the 2 men looked pretty old to me, I have to say, I remember that they spoke about being at work, so they must have been a lot younger than I am today. But the lady was fairly elderly and looked older than my granny. But the point is this. This was the first time in my life I'd ever heard a testimony from someone from an older generation. From someone who'd followed Jesus not just for years, but for decades. And I was blown away by the fact that it was possible to be a disciple of Jesus when you're old. Even when you were earning money. And you were a person who hadn't allowed the things of this life to hinder your discipleship. or to cloud your vision of God, because it was still there in them. And I remember that day as a teenager deciding that whatever life brought me, I wanted to be like those people. To be, as the psalmist says in Psalm 92, bearing fruit in old age. That's the perspective that we get as we move on from Isaac in chapter 11, verse 20 in Hebrews, to Jacob his son in 11:21, where, that we're told that Jacob worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. It's one of my favourite verses, partly because of that youth meeting. Jacob worshipped as he leaned on his staff. Now, Jacob had twin boys, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is born after Esau, but he enters the world holding on to his brother's heel. He does not find it hard to trick Esau out of their father's blessing, and Jacob lives the first part of his life greedily grabbing all he can from his relatives. Forever insecure, Jacob appears at first to be more in the line of succession of the Logan Roys of this world, rather than being an heir of the promises of God. Yet one time when he was on the run, Jacob had a vision of a staircase up to heaven. God reached out to him in a place of holy encounter that he named Bethel, meaning house of God, in Genesis 28. But it was only when he was older and increasingly desperate that he turned back to God one night at the ford Jabbok, when he wrestled with God in prayer. And on that night, he owned up to the fact that he'd tried to swindle his way into God's blessing, as he struggled to believe that God was for him. But by morning, Jacob realized that in fact God had always been there for him, and he'd never been against him. That God had had him in the palm of his hand, promising even before he was born that he would inherit God's blessing. That he was created to inherit a blessing and to pass it on. That night was a fresh start for Jacob. And in the morning he had a new name, the name of Israel. Genesis 32. Yet, interestingly, the writer to the Hebrews mentions none of this. Of course, it's because he's writing to Jewish people, and he assumes that they know all of this story already. And so he simply says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. And this is where the Zubran paintings are so helpful. The painter knew the Bible well. I tell you, I went into that room and I thought, oh, that's Jacob from Hebrews 11. It's such a privilege to have some biblical background. It was Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher, who said, the first 40 years of life give us the text. The next 30 supply the commentary on it. And it took Jacob a lifetime to recognize that he was blessed to be a blessing. At Bethel, God had said to him, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. But he didn't appreciate it until many years later he arrived at the ford Jabbok, at the place he called Peniel, meaning face of God, because he'd finally learned to accept God's blessing for himself and to pass on that blessing, which is focused on in Hebrews 11. And so now, finally, we come to Joseph. Zubran shows Joseph in later life. Here is an authoritative man, made to be ruler of Egypt, who saves lives in a time of famine. He has the authority to ensure that when he dies, his body is preserved by Egyptian embalming, so that one day it can be moved on to a different place, to the land of God's promise, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of great blessing. And all we have about Joseph, despite the chapters and chapters there are about him in Genesis, we just have one verse in Hebrews 11. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. In fact, everything in Joseph's life had been designed by God to bless the many in succession. His story begins in Genesis 37, when as a young man he has prophetic dreams that wind up his brothers and result in him being taken as a slave to Egypt. There he has all sorts of adventures and finally ends up in prison before his final promotion to the court of Pharaoh. Towards the end of Genesis, Joseph, as he looks back on his life, is able to say to his brothers who betrayed him, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Genesis 50. Joseph's testimony is that he had known the hand of God's blessing, even though there had been difficult times, when you don't understand what God is doing. Acknowledging God's hand of providence undergirding all things, Joseph has learned to bless others, even his brothers who betrayed him, even those who meant him harm. And he lived that New Testament phrase from the book of Romans, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" He can see all the time that God is moving forward. And so Hebrews highlights the burial of Joseph's bones because it's all about the future hope. Joseph's descendants and his brothers' descendants, all the children of Israel, will one day leave Egypt and move to the promised land. Don't forget that, says Joseph. It's the land of blessing given to Abraham and his descendants, a land where you will flourish and eventually a place where the Saviour of the whole world, who brings blessing to all, is born. And when they leave Egypt, they take his bones with him. You know, someone in Joseph's position should have had a really good education and just have been well set up in life. But God didn't work it that way at all. Things went wrong, in inverted commas, and yet Joseph knew that God, hand of blessing, ultimately was on it all, and that he had a plan, a salvation plan going on. Just before the service this morning, we were praying in the vestry, and someone prayed for all of those young people who are going to be receiving exam results shortly. And I just thought how important that was, and how all of us need to remember and to be reassured that God has his hand on our lives, whatever happens. I was interested to read recently that Pete Gregg, the author, said that he completely messed up his A-levels and he never went to the university course. So in a huff, he went off, I think, and did some travelling. And I don't think he ever went to university. And there he is, a well-known author and presenter. I was just amazed at how God can take a life and bring blessing, even when it doesn't feel like it, when you don't do very well at your A-levels. And so Joseph's story, remember, begins and ends in dreams and prophecy. The hand of God guiding things behind the scenes, or providence, as it's sometimes called. As you read these stories in the book of Genesis, Jacob and Joseph are quite contrasting. Jacob struggles to receive blessing as well as to pass it on, whereas Joseph knew from his early dreams that he'd inherited God's blessing. Yet most of his life was spent in hardship, and the challenge was to acknowledge the blessing in difficult places. So how about us? Because we too, as God's people, stand in this line of blessing. Henry Nouwen, in his book Bread for the Journey, wrote this. Oops. Is it possible to add? I don't know what's happened to Henry Nouwen. What's going on? Oh no, we can go back. Can we go forward? Yes. Let us not be discouraged. Jesus walks with us and speaks to us on the road. When we listen carefully, we discover that we all are already home while on the way. In other words, the blessing is always there for us, as it was for all of those characters we've looked at. And the way to live in it is to acknowledge it daily. God's presence is always there, waiting to bless us. We just have to show up, mentally at least. Now, how about finding a place daily where you can count your blessings? I found if I do that first thing, it transforms my approach to the day, and I come down to breakfast much more positive about what lies ahead. Eugene Peterson wrote this: Thanksgiving, or remembrance, internalizes a history of grace and strengthens praise into blessing, so that we act in a renewing way on our environment. I'll repeat that. Both Henry Nouwen and Eugene Peterson, they say about what everybody else would take a page to say. They say it in a sentence. So Peterson says, Thanksgiving internalizes a history of grace and strengthens praise into blessing, so that we act in a renewing way on our environment. It makes a difference, that outworking of blessing to others. A few weeks ago, Pete Greig, whose writings we use in our Lent life groups, went on a pilgrimage from Iona in Western Scotland to the island of Lindisfarne in Northumberland. And as he neared the end of his journey, he discovered this. In fact, at the time I wrote it down because I thought it's so much like these heroes of faith. And interestingly, Dave quoted it in a sermon a few weeks ago when he was talking about his travels. And Pete Greig said this: I suppose I haven't actually come here to find God, but instead I've been found by God in the act of coming here. I've been found by God in the act of coming here. God is always present, but I am not. He is always I am, but I am not. I have walked all this way not to reach a destination, but to arrive at a new beginning, where I may welcome the Lord afresh into my future and my past. Arrive at a new beginning, where I may welcome the Lord afresh into my future and my past. Just as those heroes of faith did. Abraham heard God's voice. All people on earth will be blessed through you. Isaac followed this up and prayed for blessing for his sons Jacob and Esau. Jacob encountered the presence of God in visions and prayer, and he worshipped God as he leaned on his staff. Joseph knew God's plans through dreams and prophecy. Like his great-grandfather Abraham, he was always looking ahead to God's promise of blessing for the future. God is constantly at work across the generations, seeking to bring blessing. Where do you encounter his blessings today? we're going to have a time of silent prayer now. Well, I'm going to invite you just to keep your hands open. God is here, we're sitting in his presence, but we want to be open to all the blessings that he has for us. So we're going to take a few minutes now to do that. And at the end of it, we're going to carry on in corporate prayer together, and we'll be led in our prayers by Tristan and Ellie. But before that, let's just sit in the presence of the God who loves to bless and who has his eye on us. We're here, we've showed up. If we show up mentally and ask God, what have you got? What are you blessing me with today? What's the blessing that I'm called to bring to others? Here am I. God is really smiling on his people this morning. God bless you. That's what he does.